Great. So now, this is our visitor center, and it's set up to learn a little bit about the house next door, and also the situation that was happening then. These are our main characters. This is Mr. Townsend, who owned the house next door, and he was the patriarch of the family. He had 10 children. 2 had passed away quite young. And if you have any questions, my name is Joanne, for the 3rd time, right? But, and if you have any questions, just ask me or whichever. And he had 10 children. He was a very wealthy man. He was also, his masks be crazy. He was also a very wealthy man. He owned about 350 acres back then, which is pretty far. Went until, if you're familiar with the island, Locust Valley and so on. He was actually, you either a farmer or you were a merchant back in those days to become that wealthy. And he was a merchant. He owned 5 ships that they built in Oyster Bay, and he would go back and forth to the Caribbean, back and forth to Europe, and bring in products. His son, Robert Townsend, had a store in Manhattan. And I'll tell you why it's kind of important that I bring that up in a few minutes. But anyway, so he would go back and forth as a merchant. He was also, at the time, because it was prior to the Revolutionary War, he was in the Continental Congress of New York, Provisional Continental Congress, and it was that purposely they had started this as because they were anticipating the declaration of trying to be independent from England. So he was in a way he was a spy himself too, but he was everything was very clandestine. So he was important, as I say, to the people. His son was in. Has anybody heard of the spy ring, the Culper spy ring? You have, right? Have you seen Turn?
Yes.
You have. It's really very embellished and very, not necessarily that factual. But he knew nothing of his son, but his son was part of that spy ring. That's Robert Townsend. The spy ring actually started through George Washington. He's the one that initiated the idea that we need spies, we need something to win this war, and he started the Culper spy ring. He was Culper Jr. Another group of 5 characters. They was Culper Sr. and so on and so on. But there's more to tell as we get into the house anyway. Now here, after the Battle of Long Island, the British took over all of Long Island. So we had no choice but to be at their mercy. They came into the towns, and they particularly came into this town, Oyster Bay, and they decided to how they were allowed to do it, because it was called the Quartering Act, which King George III had said that you look like you're a teacher.
I came here with my class before we knew about the Culper spy ring. It was a class trip.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's been
And
about
boy,
20 years.
they could have had it now, yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
I can see you.
Oh, yeah.
The Quartering Act.
I love
The
this
Quartering
stuff.
Act was an act that King George had said, any soldier that came to your door, this is now during the Revolutionary War, you had to let in. So when they came to it, you had to bed them, feed them, and so on. So excuse me, this is Colonel Simcoe, who did come to the door, and this is back in 17. Well, it was after the war, so it was about 1778. He came here, and they lived in the house, and that's why the house is so important. It's not only it's this firing which is very important. That's how it became so famous, but it's also because the British did live in the house. Then we have another character here that just kind of look this way. So just come this way. Come along now. I want to show you this Liz. And again, I'll elaborate more as we go. Now, Liz was a slave in the house. slavery back in the 1700s.
I'm comfortable.
Oh,
Finally.
like on the hot seat. So Liz was a slave in the house. She was a young girl.
No.
Eventually, she left. She was able to run away, and she actually ran away with Colonel Simcoe, who was the colonel in the house, the British soldier in the house. He had about 350 Queen's Rangers. Now, Queen's Rangers were not, they were probably, their heritage was probably British, but they were the Patriots, and they were the, oh my goodness,
Queen's Rangers,
the Patriots
Queen's Rangers,
and the
the
Queen's
Loyalists.
Rangers. Excuse me?
Loyalists.
The Loyalists, that's the word, that's an easy word to remember. There were the Patriots and they were Loyalists. Now, Loyalists were colonists, but they didn't want to have war. They were happy enough to keep the British, it didn't matter. So he had a fleet of about 350 soldiers. He came to the house and he settled inside, and he had a fort built. I'm going to show you little models for the Rangers, the 350 the Rangers. But so as far as Liz, we just found this out probably about maybe 2-3 years. She was a slave in the house. She eventually escaped with Colonel Simcoe. She got out and ran and so on. So it's a story that she went down south with them, and then he went north. But eventually we found out about slavery, which is about maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Again, I'll tell you when we get in there without a historian in the house. And we found out her story. We really didn't know too much about her, and there really wasn't much going on in the 1700s. But we found a lot out about her, just to bring up the fact that they did have slavery back in those days. In Oyster Bay and in parts of Long Island, there was a big family, a large family of slaves maybe about half a mile from here. All right, let's go in here and go a little more. Now, any questions about it? Oh, I'm sorry, taking the picture. Let's come in here. I just want to show you what, these are the ships that Mr. Townsend, they will go back and forth and do whatever. Joe, don't mind, just come to me.
No, don't worry about it.
Okay.
You're doing good.
He had 5 ships, and they would go from, I'm going to show you here. With Oyster Bay here. They left from New York Harbor. So from New York, they would come into the Caribbean, and then they would actually go over all the way to the Atlantic, and they would go in France and in Portugal, in the countries in Europe, and back and forth. And just to show you, I'm going to show you what he imported. Now, they imported tea, and this particular tea is called, and this particular piece of the tea is called a tea tile.
Tea brick.
A tea brick.
It's called a tea brick, and it's interesting for a lot of reasons because that's the way tea was exported. And you think, okay, how could that be tea? What they did was they would take all the moisture out of the leaves and put it into a form. Now, it's a nice hard brick so you can transport it as far as you need to transport it. But the problem is, how do you make a cup of tea? Well, you make a cup of tea by boiling water. You take that tea brick, you shave off some of the tea.
Clarity.
Say again?
Clarity.
Okay. You shave off some of the tea, or you could break a piece off and throw it into boiling water. So now you have a cup of tea. Now think about it this way. Remember the Boston Tea Party? And how we dumped all the tea because the colonists were so furious with the tax situation and taxation without representation. So the Boston Tea Party comes along, and several colonists dressed up as Native Americans, and they dumped the tea. They would dump those. Now imagine these dumping these into the Boston Harbor. Of course, you put them in the harbor, now they're going to expand. Now they expand so much. That being said, they said that the Boston Harbor was almost so thick with sludge of tea that the fish died like for 2 weeks later. And all you saw was all this tea. So now we know that the Boston Tea Hall, but was not exactly special. Now, that being said, there's a couple of items that I like to look at. First of all, you notice all these journeys that Joanne pointed out. This is an awful lot of traveling for somebody to go on a 30-foot schooner. And think about it this way, 30 feet. And he made all these journeys. Obviously, they were seaworthy, but in the meantime, this is a lot of traveling that takes place. Also, now you notice the artifacts in here. Excuse me for a second. Is everything okay?
Yeah, they have a library there.
Okay, well, they'll have to kind of tag along, okay?
Yes.
I'm sorry, what is your name?
Joanne.
Joanne, the 30 these schools were that small.
Say again, I'm sorry.
If the ships were that small,
Yeah.
weren't they bringing material back to the colonies?
Yes.
So what could they bring on a ship that small?
Well, they brought enough, and there was only not one ship, there was several. Because we have to keep in mind that Mr. Townsend, Samuel Townsend, was a very wealthy man because he was in the export-import business. That being said, it's really important because you know he has a means of money. Anybody during that period of time that were merchants, they all had a lot of money. So they were the bulk of, shall I say, the people who were interested in becoming, instead of being loyal to King George III, they were more interested in becoming patriots. Now, that being said, there's a couple of things I'd like to show you. Now, we know he's in the import-export business. What I'd like to do is just show you a couple of the items that he might have transported. Now, who's going to volunteer their nose? I need somebody with a good sniffer. Okay, there we go. Let's have a good sniffer. Okay. Now, I'm going to ask you to take a nice little, don't go too deep. But I want you to take a nice little sniff, and I want you to tell me what you think it might be. Go ahead. It's not terribly pleasant, in my opinion. Get that nose going there. Any guesses? Not pleasant. Dried fish. Remember, dried fish, like cod, dried codfish. So now, what's one of the things you might have done? Okay, now, another thing.
Fish.
Another thing that was interesting as well. Okay, now, I have to look at what they are because I don't remember. Now, we did, there's a lot of importing and exporting stuff. That being said, somebody else volunteer their nose. Who's gonna volunteer their nose? Give me a sniff. Of this. What do you think it might be? What do you think it might be? Well, now we have camphor. Camphor is remember, he's in the import-export business. Remember, he goes from one place to another. Remember, this man's he's in all of these different ports. Now,